They called him useless. They dismissed him as a frail middle-aged dentist, hopelessly out of place in the brutal theater of jungle warfare, a man whose hands were meant for delicate repairs, not for wielding instruments of war. What could a 40-year-old dentist possibly contribute to the blood-soaked campaign for the Solomon Islands? Little did anyone know, in the suffocating heat of a place called Bloody Ridge, this man would undergo a transformation so profound, so devastatingly effective, it would pass into legend. This is not just a story of combat. It is the story of a quiet man who, when faced with an annihilating tide of enemy soldiers, would perform an act of such staggering defiance that it would rewrite his destiny. This is the story of how a man they mocked became the dentist of death. In the pre-dawn darkness of October 25, 1942, on the besieged island of Guadalcanal, the fate of the American perimeter at Henderson Field hung by a thread. For the men of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division, a night of unimaginable terror was about to reach its climax. And at the very tip of the spear, in a shallow, muddy hole on the ridgeline, was Captain John L. Doc Hersey, a United States Army dentist. To understand the magnitude of what happened that night, we must understand the man and the moment. John Hersey was not a career soldier. He was a dental surgeon from Iowa, commissioned into the Army Dental Corps. In 1942, at the age of 40, he was attached to the 25th Infantry Division's 161st Infantry Regiment, but found himself temporarily serving with the Marines on Guadalcanal, a desperate place, where every able body, regardless of branch or specialty, was pressed into the line. Guadalcanal was the fulcrum of the Pacific War. The Allied capture of the half-finished Japanese airstrip, renamed Henderson Field, was a thorn in Japan's side. The Imperial Japanese Army was determined to retake it, launching a series of massive Bonzi-style assaults against the thin American lines. The Marines and soldiers holding those lines were exhausted, ravaged by disease, and critically short of supplies. They were living on captured Japanese rice and sheer willpower. Into this arena walked Captain Hersey. To the battle-hardened young Marines, he must have seemed an anachronism. He was older, spoke softly, and carried himself with a professional, medical demeanor. His weapon was not a rifle, but a dental drill. In the brutal hierarchy of combat infantry, a non-combatant officer, especially one from another service, was often viewed with suspicion or outright disdain. The moniker useless dentist was a cruel, whispered label, born of the frontline soldiers' grim pragmatism. What they failed to see was the steel beneath the calm exterior. The strategic situation was catastrophic. The Japanese 17th Army, under General Hyakutake, had launched a major coordinated offensive designed to overwhelm Henderson Field in a single, violent night. The main thrust was aimed at the southern sector of the perimeter, defended by the 1st Marine Division and the Army's 164th Infantry, but a critical supporting attack was targeted at a vulnerable seam in the lines held by the 7th Marines. The location was a grassy, commanding rise already stained with past battles, Edson's Ridge, now known simply as Bloody Ridge. If this position fell, the Japanese could roll up the entire American defense. The night of October 25th was to be the decisive act. As dusk settled over the ridge on October 24th, a palpable dread thickened the humid air. Patrols reported heavy enemy movement in the jungle below. The tangled dark mass of the jungle seemed to breathe with menace. Captain Hersey, having volunteered to stay forward with the Marines, was positioned in a forward weapon pit. He was not manning a dental chair, but a .30 caliber, water-cooled Browning M1917 machine gun. It was a heavy, complex weapon, often operated by a two-man team. Hersey had trained on it, but he was no machine gunner. Yet, there he was. The first probing attacks began just after nightfall. Shadowy figures flitted between the trees. Grenades exploded with muffled thumps, the rattle of American rifles, and the distinctive burp of Japanese Type 99 light machine guns filled the gaps between the deafening roars of artillery shells crashing in the jungle. The Marines beat back these initial tests, but everyone knew this was just the beginning. The real hammer blow was coming. Through the long, tense hours, the pressure built. Japanese units were maneuvering into position for a massed banzai charge. Their doctrine was clear: use overwhelming numbers and sheer ferocity to break the American line through close-quarters combat. For the defenders, waiting was a psychological torture. Each rustle in the undergrowth, each distant shout in Japanese, coiled the nerves tighter. By midnight, an unnatural quiet descended, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the constant drone of insects. It was the calm before the storm. Then, at approximately 0200 hours on the 25th, the storm broke. A flare suddenly burst overhead, casting an eerie, wavering light over the no-man's land. And in that ghostly illumination, the defender saw a sight that froze the blood. Not dozens, but hundreds of Japanese soldiers of the 4th Infantry Regiment were emerging from the tree line. They came in waves, a screaming, howling tide of humanity. They wore white bands around their heads and sleeves for identification in the dark. They charged with fixed bayonets, firing their Arisaka rifles from the hip, led by officers waving samurai swords. The noise was apocalyptic, a cacophony of screaming, bugle calls, and the thunder of their charging feet. Their objective was singular: overrun the ridge, kill everyone in their path, and charge straight onto Henderson Field. The American line erupted. Rifle fire snapped in a continuous crackle. Mortar rounds walked into the advancing ranks, but the Japanese kept coming, absorbing horrific casualties with fanatical discipline. They poured through gaps, overrunning forward foxholes. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the darkness. The Marine line began to bend, and in places, threatened to shatter. The crisis of the battle had arrived. In the chaos, Captain Hersey's section of the line became a focal point. His machine gun, with its steady, traversing fire, was a key to holding back the flood. But the enemy knew this too. Japanese light machine guns and knee mortar began to concentrate fire on his position. Bullets snapped overhead and kicked up geysers of dirt around his pit. The man beside him, the assistant gunner, was hit and fell gravely wounded. Then, another member of the crew was killed outright. By 0230 hours, John Hersey was alone with a complex machine gun, in a hole in the ground, with a tsunami of enemy infantry, perhaps 50 yards away, and closing. The water in the gun's cooling jacket was steaming from the sustained fire. Ammunition belts were running low. On his left and right, the sounds of close combat grunts, screams. The clash of steel told him the line was disintegrating. He was a dentist from Iowa, surrounded by the sounds of hell, with the entire weight of the assault beginning to focus on his solitary position. This was the impossible moment. The crisis. The wire had been stretched to its breaking point. Fear, a cold, metallic taste, must have gripped him. He was not an infantry captain. He was a medical officer. His duty, by all conventional standards, was to the wounded. He could have withdrawn to aid them, and no court-martial would have condemned him. The logical, the human, the medical choice was to fall back. But John Hersey looked at the machine gun. He looked at the oncoming tide of white headbands glowing in the tracer's light. He saw the silhouettes of his fellow Marines fighting and dying to his flanks. And in that moment, a switch flipped. The dentist receded. The soldier emerged. What happened next was not a blind, panicked spray of fire. It was the application of a precise, surgical mind to the mechanics of mass destruction. Hersey became a one-man strongpoint. He fed the long, heavy belts of .30 caliber ammunition into the receiver, his hands moving with a methodical rhythm that belied the chaos. He traversed the gun back and forth. In short, controlled bursts, just as he had been taught. BRRRP. Brope, brope. Each burst was aimed, cutting down the front ranks of the charging enemy. The Japanese immediately identified his position as the primary obstacle. Concentrated rifle and machine gun fire now focused solely on him. Bullets chipped the dirt fortification around him. A knee mortar round landed just feet away, the concussion ringing in his ears and showering him with debris. But he did not stop. The water in the cooling jacket boiled away. The barrel began to glow, a dull cherry red in the darkness. A weapon in this state could cook off fire rounds from the heat alone, until it melted, or the ammunition was exhausted. It was a deadly hazard. Hersey had no water, no assistant, no time. So, he used the only coolant available. He urinated into the steaming jacket, the acrid smell mixing with cordite and damp earth, allowing the gun to keep firing. It was an act of utterly desperate improvisation. For over 3 brutal hours, the assault continued in relentless waves. Hersey's world shrank to the view over his gun's sights. The flashing muzzles of enemy rifles, the contorted faces of charging soldiers, the stumbling fall of those hit. He was no longer a man, but a component of the weapon itself. Calculating eye, a steady hand, a relentless will. His position became an island in a sea of violence. At one point, Japanese infantrymen closed to within 10 yards of his hole, only to be cut down by his final point-blank bursts, or by Marines fighting with knives and entrenching tools in the nearby trenches. The physical toll was immense. The recoil of the heavy gun hammered his shoulder, bruising it deeply. The deafening noise, the searing heat from the barrel, the exhaustion of constant motion. It was a trial that would break most men. Yet, he held. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep into the eastern sky, the ferocity of the assault began to ebb. The last, disorganized groups of Japanese soldiers melted back into the jungle, leaving a horrific tableau of carnage sprawled across the slope before the American lines. Silence returned, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the crackle of burning brush. Smoke hung heavy in the damp air. John Hersey, slumped behind his gun, finally allowed himself to stop. The barrel was warped. The pit was surrounded by spent brass, and before him, the ground was littered with the fallen. As the sun rose, revealing the full scope of the battle, the Marines began to assess the cost and the damage. The line had held. Henderson Field was secure. The Japanese offensive had been shattered with catastrophic losses, and as soldiers ventured out from their positions, they began to see the staggering result of one-man stand. The arc of fire from Captain Hersey's machine gun position was a killing ground. The density of enemy dead was unlike anything else along that sector of the ridge. A careful count was made, not out of morbid curiosity, but for battlefield assessment. The number was verified by multiple witnesses, including his battalion commander. John Hersey, the useless dentist, had single-handedly killed 98 Japanese soldiers. He had wounded scores more. He had broken the back of repeated human wave assaults against his sector. His precise, sustained fire had not just killed, it had disrupted, channeled, and ultimately stopped the momentum of the attack at a critical hinge in the American line. The news spread through the exhausted ranks like an electric current. The mockery evaporated, replaced by a stunned, profound respect. This quiet older man had done what every Marine aspired to do. He had held his ground against impossible odds and saved the lives of the men beside him. He had turned a tool of defense into an instrument of salvation. Later that morning, as medics tended to the wounded, Hersey finally returned to his medical duties. His hands, now bruised and shaking from hours of controlling the violent machine gun, went back to performing delicate work stitching wounds, setting bones, offering comfort. The duality was complete. He was both the compassionate healer and the relentless defender. The Marines who saw him now looked at him with a new understanding. He was not Doc the dentist anymore. He was Doc, the gunner. His actions were immediately reported up the chain of command. In an army and a war that generated countless acts of bravery, Hersey's stood out for its sheer, unbelievable scale and the incredible narrative of his identity. He had not been a trained infantryman seeking glory. He was a specialist, thrust into the heart of darkness, who had risen to meet it with a cool, professional fury that left hardened combat veterans in awe. The battle for Henderson Field was a decisive American victory. The Japanese 17th Army, having suffered over 3,500 casualties in the failed October offensive, would never again mount a serious threat to retake the airfield. Guadalcanal would be secured by February 1943, marking the irreversible turning point in the Pacific War. For his actions on the night of October 24th to 25th, 1942, Captain John L. Hersey was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the United States Army's second highest award for valor. The citation credited him with extraordinary heroism in action, noting his superb courage and aggressive leadership, which contributed materially to the defeat of a fanatical enemy and to the successful defense of the American position. He returned to the United States a hero. His story featured in newspapers and magazines. He served out the remainder of the war, eventually retiring from the Army Dental Corps as a lieutenant colonel. Yet, by all accounts, John Hersey remained a modest man. He rarely spoke of that night on Bloody Ridge, perhaps burdened by the terrible weight of what he had been forced to do. He returned to dentistry, to a life of quiet service, carrying the memories of the men he fought beside, and the unthinkable number of those he stopped. His legacy is a powerful testament to the unpredictable nature of courage. It proves that heroism is not the sole province of the warrior by trade. It can reside in the most unexpected of persons, waiting for the moment when duty, circumstance, and sheer human will coalesce into an act of defining valor. John Hersey's story is a permanent rebuke to prejudice, to snap judgments, and to the very concept of uselessness. On a ridge whose name spoke of slaughter, a dentist wrote a prescription of lead and fire, and in doing so, saved countless lives and carved his name into the history of the Second World War. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War, a story of an unlikely hero, a desperate stand, and the thin line between obscurity and legend. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. In the annals of the Second World War, heroes often fit a certain mold. The grizzled sergeant, the fearless pilot, the cunning commando, But in the heart of the Pacific, on an island whose name became synonymous with hell, a hero emerged who defied every expectation. He was a man whose profession was healing, whose hands were trained for precision, not for killing. His comrades saw not a warrior, but a middle-aged dentist, a man they quietly dismissed as a useless weight in a brutal fight for survival. What happened next would shatter every assumption. When the darkness screamed and the line threatened to break, this man would perform an act of calculated, sustained violence, so effective it would border on the mythic. This is the story of Captain John L. Doc Hersey. This is the story of how a dentist, armed with a machine gun and an unbreakable will, killed 98 enemy soldiers in a single night and saved an entire sector of the front. This is the story of the most unlikely gunner of Guadalcanal. On the black, rain-soaked night of October 25, 1942, the fate of the American beachhead on Guadalcanal rested on the shoulders of exhausted Marines and soldiers dug into a jagged spine of earth called Bloody Ridge. And in a forward weapon pit, a U.S. Army dental surgeon prepared to meet an avalanche of steel and fanaticism. The setting was the ultimate test of men and materiel. Guadalcanal. By October 1942, the campaign had degenerated into a savage stalemate. The Allies clung to Henderson Field and a precarious perimeter, while the Japanese 17th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayek, marshaled its forces in the dense jungle for a final, crushing blow. The objective was simple: overwhelm the American lines in a coordinated night assault, swarm the airfield, and drive the invaders into the sea. The American defenders, a mix of the 1st Marine Division and the U.S. Army's 164th and 182nd Infantry Regiments, were at the end of their endurance. Ravaged by malaria, dysentery, and a scant diet, they existed in a state of perpetual tension. Every shadow in the jungle could conceal an enemy sniper. Every night brought the threat of a screaming bonsai charge. Into this world walked Captain John Hersey, a 1940 graduate of the University of Iowa College of Dentistry. Hersey was a commissioned officer in the Army Dental Corps, attached to the 25th Infantry Division. Temporarily assigned to support the Marines, he was, by all traditional military metrics, a non. His assigned weapon was a .45 caliber pistol, largely for sale to the young Marines, many still in their teens, all hardened by months of combat. This soft-spoken, 40-year-old from the Army was an alien presence in the brutal hierarchy of the front line, where utility meant the ability to kill and survive. A dentist seemed a luxury they could ill afford. The nickname, when it came, was inevitable and cruel: the useless dentist. But Hersey was not content to remain in the rear. Understanding the dire manpower shortage, he volunteered for forward duty. He learned the mechanics of the company's heavy weapons, specifically the water-cooled Browning M1917A1 machine gun, a sustained fire weapon that was the bedrock of a rifle company's defense. He was determined to pull his weight. The strategic chessboard was set. Japanese intelligence had identified a perceived weak point in the American southern perimeter, the sector held by the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, on what was formerly known as Edson's Ridge. The plan, part of the larger Matanico offensive, called for the crack Japanese 4th Infantry Regiment to assault this position with overwhelming force. Their tactics were a doctrine of shock and terror, massed infantry charges, designed to infiltrate and collapse the defense through sheer numbers and ferocity. For Hersey and the men around him, the night of October 24th would be a descent into a close-quarter nightmare. As the tropical dusk faded to an inky blackness, on October 24th, the atmosphere on the ridge grew thick with apprehension. The usual jungle chorus seemed muted, as if the wildlife itself was holding its breath. Forward observers reported the distinct sounds of movement, clinking equipment, low voices, the snap of branches from the dense jungle beyond the grassy kunai field that sloped away from the American positions. Captain Hersey was manning his machine gun pit, a hastily dug position reinforced with sandbags. His crew consisted of a few Marines, but the weapon was ultimately his responsibility. The .30 caliber Browning, fed by 250-round cloth belts, was a beast of a gun, weighing over 100 pounds with its tripod and water jacket filled. Its steady, plunging fire could cut down tall grass and men with equal efficiency. The first contact came just after 2,200 hours. A burst of fire from a Marine listening post. Then another. Shadows detached themselves from the tree line. The initial probes were testing the defenses, seeking weak spots. Rifle fire crackled up and down the line. Japanese knee mortar, with their distinctive thump of discharge, began dropping light high explosive rounds behind the front trenches. seeking to disrupt reinforcements and communications. For hours, a tense, sporadic battle of wills played out in the darkness. Flares would suddenly pop overhead, casting long, dancing shadows, and freezing enemy soldiers in ghostly In these moments of stark illumination, the defenders could see the numbers building. Small groups coalesced into platoons, then into company-sized formations. The enemy was not retreating. He was marshalling. By 0100 hours, on the 25th, the pressure reached a boiling point. The Japanese commanders, their forces assembled, gave the order. A green flare arched into the sky over the jungle, and then, the night exploded. A unified, blood-curdling scream. Bonsai, bonsai ripped through the air, a wave of sound preceding the wave of men. Hundreds of soldiers from the 4th Regiment surged forward, a dark, boiling mass against the lighter grass. They charged in human waves, their bayonets fixed, their officers leading from the front with swords. Bugles sounded frantic calls. The sheer volume of their shouts was a weapon in itself. Designed to paralyze with fear, the entire American line erupted in response. Mortar crews fired pre-registered concentrations at point-blank range. Grenades were hurled in arcs. Riflemen fired as fast as they could work their bolts. But the Japanese tide kept coming, washing over forward outposts, engulfing isolated foxholes. The battle dissolved into a chaotic, close-quarter melee of bullets, blades, and fists. In Hersey's sector, the world narrowed to the field of fire in front of his gun. His initial bursts were controlled, disciplined, aiming at the center mass of the advancing waves. The water in the jacket began to steam. His assistant gunner fed the belts, shouting status reports over the din. Then, catastrophe struck. A concentrated burst of enemy fire raked their position. The assistant gunner cried out and fell, seriously wounded. Another member of the crew was hit moments later. By 0230 hours, John Hersey was alone. Truly alone. The men in adjacent rifle pits were fighting for their own lives, unable to assist him. His machine gun, its water nearly boiled dry, was dangerously hot. Ammunition was dwindling, and through the smoke and tracer-lit chaos, he could see the next wave forming. A new phalanx of white headbands preparing to charge directly at his isolated position. The crisis was absolute. He was a dentist, alone in a hole, with the decisive point of a major battle rushing toward him. This was the crucible, the moment where doctrine, training, and even instinct are stripped away, leaving only the core of a man. Retreat was a possibility, a logical one. His medical training screamed at him to seek cover, to tend to the wounded. No one would have blamed him. But as Hersey looked at the grim, determined faces of the Marines in nearby holes, as he heard their shouts of defiance and pain, a different imperative took hold. He made his decision. He would hold. What followed was a 3-hour masterclass in tenacity and lethal marksmanship. Hersey became a machine. He repositioned the heavy gun himself, finding the optimal enfilading angle against the main avenue of approach. He fed the remaining ammunition belts, his hands moving with a calm, deliberate rhythm that betrayed no panic. He ignored the enemy fire, now concentrated solely on him. The snap of bullets past his ears, the thud of rounds impacting the sandbags. The Browning roared to life again, but this time its song was directed by a single, relentless conductor. BRRR, P. Travers. Brope. Travers. He fired in short, 68-round bursts, conserving ammo and preventing the barrel from melting outright. The effect on the densely packed attackers was horrifyingly efficient. Each burst scythed down 3 or 4 men. He walked his fire along the line, breaking up formations, forcing the survivors to ground. But the gun could not endure. The water jacket ran dry. In the darkness, Hersey could see the metal of the barrel beginning to glow, a dull, sinister red. A catastrophic cook-off was seconds away. Without hesitation, he did what he had to. He urinated into the empty jacket, the liquid instantly vaporizing into steam with a sharp hissing sound, but providing just enough coolant to keep the mechanism functional. The Japanese, recognizing this single gun as the linchpin of the defense, redoubled their efforts to silence it. Small teams attempted to flank his position, crawling through the grass. Hersey, his senses heightened to a razor's edge, spotted movement and swung the gun to meet them, cutting them down at near point-blank range. At one point, a Japanese officer, brandishing a sword, led a final desperate rush. Hersey's burst caught him center mass, the momentum carrying the officer's body to within feet of the gun pit. The physical toll was immense. The gun's recoil hammered his shoulder with the force of a battering ram, again and again. The deafening noise in the confined pit was a physical pressure. The stench of cordite, spent brass, steam, and death filled his nostrils. Yet, His focus never wavered. He was no longer Captain Hersey DDS. He was a function, an algorithm of aim, fire, traverse, and survive. As the first faint, gray light of dawn began to dilute the absolute blackness, the attacks lost their cohesion. The sheer magnitude of their losses had broken the regiment's spirit. The surviving Japanese soldiers began to withdraw, dragging some of their wounded back into the jungle's embrace. The sound of battle faded, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence, and the low moans of the wounded scattered across the bullet-shewed slope. Hersey finally released his grip on the triggers. His hands were blistered, his body trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline crash. He looked out over his handiwork. The grassy slope was littered with enemy dead, many piled in windrows, where his traversing fire had caught them. The Browning, now silent, was a smoking, ruined piece of metal, its barrel warped beyond repair. With the coming of full light, the scale of the victory and the cost became clear. The Marine and Army line had held. The Japanese 4th Regiment had been virtually annihilated as an effective fighting force. As troops cautiously moved out to police the battlefield, retrieve wounded, and assess the enemy dead, they congregated around Hersey's position in stunned silence. The field before his gun was a charnel house. The pattern of the fallen told the story, a wide, fan-shaped arc of concentrated death, radiating from the muzzle of his Browning. A formal count was ordered. Men moved from body to body, tallying the results. The number was verified by lieutenants, captains, and the battalion commander himself. It was a number so large it seemed implausible. 98 enemy soldiers were killed by the direct fire of one man over 3 hours of continuous combat. Dozens more lay wounded further down the slope, victims of his grazing fire. He had not just defended a position, he had dominated a battlefield. The news rippled through the battalion, then the regiment. The Marines who had once scoffed now looked at the quiet, bespectacled army captain with something akin to awe. The transformation of perception was total and instantaneous. The useless dentist had become, in the space of one night, a legendary figure. He had embodied the very essence of the citizen soldier, the unassuming man who, when civilization's edge is threatened, reveals an inner fortitude that changes the course of events. Later that morning, despite his exhaustion and injuries, John Hersey returned to his primary duty. He picked up his medical kit and moved along the line, tending to American wounded with the same calm, precise hands that had wielded the machine gun. He performed triage, administered morphine, and cleaned wounds. The dichotomy was complete. He was both the most lethal man on the ridge that night, and the foremost agent of mercy come the dawn. His actions were a tactical masterstroke that had operational consequences. By shattering the main assault against his sector, Hersey had protected the flank of the entire ridgeline. His stand had allowed adjacent units to maintain their cohesion, preventing a potentially disastrous penetration. The failure of the 4th Regiment's attack was a key factor in the overall collapse of the Japanese October offensive. For his extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, Captain John L. Hersey was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The official citation read, in part, his machine gun emplacement was subjected to intense hostile fire, but despite the danger, he continued to fire with telling effect into the enemy ranks. His superb courage and aggressive leadership were an inspiration to the entire command and contributed materially to the defeat of a fanatical enemy. He would later also receive the Purple Heart for wounds received during the battle. After Guadalcanal, Hersey served for the remainder of the war, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel. He returned to Iowa, raised a family, and resumed his dental practice. Like so many of the greatest generation, he spoke little of the war, carrying the memories privately. John Hersey's legacy endures as one of the most remarkable individual combat feats of the Pacific War. It is a story that transcends the mere tally of casualties. It is a narrative about the latent potential within ordinary people, about the fallacy of judging capability by appearance or profession. In the face of annihilation, his response was not blind rage, but applied intellect, steadfast courage, and an unwavering sense of duty to the men beside him. He proved that on a battlefield, the will of one determined individual, correctly positioned and imbued with resolve, can become a force multiplier of incalculable value. The ridge where he fought was already named for bloodshed. That night, a dentist from Iowa added a new, profoundly personal chapter to its history, teaching a timeless lesson. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than fear. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War, a story of unlikely heroism, of quiet professionals thrust into the crucible, and of the moments that define legacies. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.